director of the Center for Catholic Social Thought here at Assumption. We jump in here with Kelly in our second talk. This is a different talk than we had last night. We learned the last couple of days that when you say two talks, people hear two of the same talks. So if you missed but this will actually be part two, a different talk than we had last night. Good news is if you missed the first part and you want to hear it, in a couple of weeks, my wonderful assistant and colleague Tyler will have it up online. What else about this? So Kelly, Dr. Kelly Johnson has been professor of religious studies, teaching Catholic theology and Catholic social teaching at the University of Dayton for the past 22 years. I came to know of Kelly through being at Duke, doing my doctorate with her doctoral advisor just about 10 years later than she was, and realized that this is sort of this topic is sort of her wheelhouse. And so I thought, well, that person that I've never met before, I would really love to get to know her. And so let's bring her out to talk about love of neighbor and fear of beggars. So just a brief recap, and then I'll hand it over to her. What we're going to do is same thing we did last night, about 45 minutes of Kelly talking, and then we'll do about maybe 5 minutes of table conversation, and then maybe 15 or 20 minutes of conversation with Kelly, and then we'll be out of here. So last night, among other things, Kelly gave us some history, making the point that when we come to recognize that our ideas have a history, specifically here ideas about beggars or poverty or tent cities or people flying signs, a lot of stuff that we see right outside Assumption, when we come to realize that our ideas about those sorts of encounters or people have a history, we are freed up to think differently about them. In particular, Kelly told us the story of the creation of the beggar as a sort of villain, an obstacle to the ideal social order, in which the ideal citizen comes to be seen as one who individually controls and possesses his wealth privately in the form of money. And therefore, the elimination of beggary has been a central part, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, but still today some. The elimination of beggary has been a central part of the project of creating the individualist social order that we still have today. Thus, the beggar becomes a sort of opposite to all our highest ideals, whether we pity them or fear them. And Kelly's way of putting it is really striking, I think, because it has the advantage of pointing out that the beggar is not merely an obstacle to the creation of this individualist order, but our images and feelings about beggars are part of that social order itself. Today, I understand Kelly is going to point us towards some alternatives to the way that our history has been constructed. So, welcome, Kelly.
Thanks. All right. It's really a privilege to be invited. And wow, Colin, thank you. I'm so glad that's recorded because I want to write down what you said. You made what I said make a lot more sense. It was really great. So I want to start today actually by talking about Greg Boyle. You guys know Father Greg Boyle? If you don't know who Father Greg Boyle is, then the first thing you should do after this talk is go out and pick up some of Father Greg Boyle's books, or you can look him up online. He gives a ton of little lectures that you can find online. I just think Greg Boyle is one of the great voices of our day. Boyle is the founder of Homeboy Industries. He's a Jesuit priest. He was in a parish there that had a lot of gang activity. And the parish initiated this sort of outreach to gang members which over time developed into a really impressive wide array of job training opportunities and some other kinds of things that help people who want to get out of gang life take up a different way of life. I didn't start reading Greg Boyle's work for a long time. I was really late coming to it, and the reason was I thought, oh, gangs, that's not my thing. I don't really, that was my mistake, to think that what he would be saying about gang members didn't have anything to do with me or with my students or with my parishioners. What Boyle is talking about is, the way he'll describe it, the struggle of the soul to know its worth. Right? That's the issue. To know its worth and to recognize its kinship with other souls. So at this most basic level, the thing that's really moving to me about his work is that, in that sense, the struggle of these gang members to find their way is something that I absolutely identify with. I see myself in those stories all the time. Now, the other great thing about Greg Boyle is that his approach is not at all solemn. Y'all are getting me, and I tend to be, I'm a weighty intellectual, of course, as you can tell. Greg Boyle there's just this amazing sort of joy about him. I like to use, around his work, I like to use the word hilarious, both because the stories he tells are hilarious in the sense of making you laugh, and for those of you who are real liturgical nerds, as I am, there's an ancient Greek hymn for evening prayer. When you're welcoming in the light in the evening, which is the light of Christ that's going to be with us in evening prayer, the name of the ancient hymn is Phos Hilaron, which is joyous light. Hilaron is the word to describe this sort of joyous light of Christ appearing in the darkness. So when I hear hilarity, I also hear this kind of echo of joy of Christ in it, which I think is very much what's happening with Greg Boyle. Just to give you a sample, one of my favorite stories he talks about, they have a cafe where people who used to be gang members can be employed, and learn waitstaff and cooking and those kind of skills. And he tells the story about one time somebody brought the actress Diane Keaton to eat there, and the waitress, who had been, imprisoned and done all that stuff and was now, learning to be a good waitress, came up to the table and she looked at Diane Keaton and said, "Don't I know you from someplace?" And Diane Keaton said, "Oh no, people say that all the time. Just no." And the woman said, "No, I know. We were locked up together, weren't we?" and I think for Boyle, it's like, okay, it's just a humanizing story, but it's also about recognizing kinship, the discovery of kinship, right? In unexpected places, people feel connected to each other, ways you wouldn't expect. He says, people ask me, well, does it always happen that people find these bonds? And he says, yeah, it does, actually. So, Greg Boyle, go look up his work. I want to start with that bit because, as those of you who were here last night know, I think it's always important that we first start with gratitude for God's goodness in creating and bearing with this creation that includes me and includes each of you and includes a lot of other people as well. That creation, it's groaning for its fulfillment, and that is painful for us. We know that we are made for something better than what we currently have. The good news is that the God we meet in Jesus Christ is all in with us. All in, nothing held back. So, Colin gave you a great little summary, but I'm going to give you mine as well. The problem that I was unfolding last night. We live in a social order that does value tenderness and care, but relegates them to home, to the private life, to philanthropic donations that express our personal commitments. Interesting to think about how that's related to the sort of vast industry now of self-care, right? We do value tenderness and healing, but it's very personalized. As a social and an economic order, though, when you're talking about life in the streets, life in our laws, life in our economic system, we understand justice and freedom, these kind of key terms in public life, to be really a matter of balancing power among strangers. And we do that because we want to preserve individual freedom, right? That's the way we stay free. And all of this ends up meaning that we live in a system that caters much better to the whims of the rich than to the necessities of the poor. People who can pay can get anything. People who can't pay can't get even what they most need. We associate privatization and being strangers to each other with freedom, and we tend to associate involvement with other people's needs to see that as a burden. It's a burden an individual might choose to take on, but it's a burden and a limitation. So understandably, people get freaked out, disproportionately freaked out by beggars, because beggars confuse those categories. They ask us in public to do something that we would readily do in private, but we don't know how to do it in public. They trigger ideas that have been developed in our history, as Colin was talking about, ideas that make us to be very suspicious about hypocrisy and worried about disruption of our good order. They break the rule that says in this advanced society, we should all engage with each other as free and independent strangers, particularly by honoring each other's private property. And yet, that vision that I hope you can recognize as something that sort of governs our public life, that vision is very fragile. It's very easily threatened. All it takes is a beggar asking for help, and we suddenly feel very confused, very upset, very distressed, because the reasoning is so thin. It's not enough to be a full account of our lives. The reality is we are not just individuals. We are not all independent. We are not just families. We live in a social order. We live in cities. Our streets are also part of our full life. They're certainly important to our spiritual lives. So we can't just bracket these questions of tenderness and interdependence and care off from public life. Right. And for Christians, then there's also the nagging sense that the beggar we ignore might be Jesus himself in a distressing disguise. It's a very disturbing thought. So what do we do about this? I know last night, those of you who were here last night, people were really looking for answers about what to do about beggars. And as I've said, I don't think there's a single answer because people are complicated, situations are different, different encounters call for different kind of responses. I do think anything we can do that increases a kind of sense of humanity in ourselves and in the people we encounter is always a good thing. A better step, a step toward something more like what Greg Boyle is doing with gang members, recognizing that the soul is striving for its worth and that's my soul as well as the soul of the person I'm encountering. Finding ways to pay attention to that encounter is important. I will say my years of living in community with people who have been unhoused, with refugees, with women who are fleeing from histories of violence, have taught me this. People are amazing and funny and really complicated. One woman I was thinking about last night, Pauline, so a woman I got to know while I was working with a Catholic worker actually in Connecticut. And she was one of those people who pushed all of her precious belongings around in a shopping cart in the city and would frequently push them into the middle of traffic and then stand in the street and scream at the cars. She had a little bit of a speech impediment, so people couldn't usually understand what she was saying, which I think was probably a mercy because it might have been worse if they had understood what she was saying. So I had been around her a number of times. One day I saw her, she was picking fights with everybody. She was really being a pill. And I pulled her aside and said, "What is with you?" And she said, "Oh, it's my hair." She was having a bad hair day. And now, one to look at Pauline, if you didn't know her, if you didn't have this conversation with her, you might think her personal hygiene was not a big issue for her life. It didn't seem to be something she was particularly concerned about. But she was having a bad hair day, and I certainly understand myself how having a bad hair day can make you very cross with everybody around you. I was able to spend some time with her and, taking care of hair and coming to recognize that the human beings we see in these situations, there are hilarious and beautiful and tender and complicated and difficult things going on with each of them. I think that's a really important step that we can take. And I think we can understand it making a shift, right? A little shift here. Understand it also in terms that Pope St. John Paul II used when he talked about the culture of life. John Paul was noticing this irony that sometimes the most advanced societies that look to be places that are all about promoting health and wellness and strong personal fulfillment, that those societies are also often societies which most quickly cast people aside. People who don't fit into that model. People who speak the wrong language, people who have significant disabilities, people who are unborn, people who are near to death, people who have committed crimes. Because we're so focused on the strong, sorry, my iPad is not cooperating with me. Because we're so focused on this picture of the strong and independent person, it becomes hard for us to think about the people who don't fit that model. People who need some care. And John Paul II's culture of life was really all about thinking through how do we make room for people who take more time, or who aren't productive, or who can't be independent, who are suffering in ways that we can't resolve, people who are not verbal, who don't communicate well. How do we let them in so that their lives become part of ours? And recognize the mess that happens in our life when we let them in, that mess is the good life that God is giving to us. That's what he meant by the culture of life, right? And I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about trying to engage constructively or more constructively with people who don't fit into our kind of models. And to be clear what this means, we're talking about culture of life, it means the problem is not just them, right? The problem is us. Because the opposite of a culture of life is a culture of death, where we're also captive in a culture of death, if that's the way we're living. Okay, well, I wanted to add in John Paul II because this is kind of a bridge, moving from thinking about the concerns for a person with mental illness on the street corner on Tuesday morning toward thinking about bigger picture questions about a culture and a social order and an economy. I want to emphasize that the real answer for how we can become better equipped to face people in need, whether that's ourselves, our family members, strangers on the street, the answer to that and the answer about how to address why is there such gross inequality in our society? Why don't we have decent human services for people who are sick or traumatized or addicted or disabled? That the questions, those two questions are linked, and the solution to them has to do with thinking about the social order, not just about how we do that individual encounter. So that's why I started last night, I started a kind of a tour of the story of salvation as a social story. The story of salvation is a social story. That's why I talked about St. Francis doing something that actually amounted to an economic critique of a new development in his society. Yes, it's saintly. Yes, it was a personal practice of devotion. It was also a social critique of a new economic form. Our social network is a site of struggle and a site of grace. And I want to direct our attention to that. This isn't a way of turning away from personal responsibility. I know people worry about that if we're talking about the social structure. What about personal responsibility? Trust me, this is going to be a thing that's all about personal responsibility. But we have to recognize that our personal action always happens in a social frame, right? So I want to pay attention particularly to that social frame today. Okay, so the hero for today is the guy that brought Colin and me together, Peter Morin. He's a hero. He didn't get everything right, but he did a lot of really great stuff. So let me tell you a little bit about Peter Morin. Peter was born in 1877 to a peasant family in rural France. He trained to be a Salesian brother. He taught at a series of schools. They think maybe things weren't going very well with him as a teacher because he kept getting moved to a new school every year. He decided not to take final vows, or possibly the order decided that he ought not take final vows. Not everything about Peter's life is very well understood. Anyway, he then became involved as a layperson with an important Catholic social reform movement in France, the Sillon. But then he moved on from that as well and emigrated to Canada. Evidence suggests actually that he was maybe trying to avoid another term of military service. As a matter of conscience, he had decided he would not do military service anymore. Anyway, he moved to Canada, was trying homesteading, then he moved into a series of manual labor jobs. So we're talking about now the early 1900s, right? He's riding the rails with other people who are moving around the country, taking up manual labor. And all the while he's doing this, he was reading and thinking. Peter's just a voracious, self-taught intellectual. And he was reviewing his own vocation, trying to understand what his calling was, right? He thought he would become a Salesian. He thought he'd become a teacher. He's trying out all these different things, trying to figure where his place is. For several years, he settled, I think, in Chicago, working as a French teacher. And then he was on the move again. He started teaching French, but offering his classes for free and asking people to only pay him what they could afford, what they thought it was worth. This was a little, what Gandhi calls an experiment in truth. He was trying something out in life that he had an idea about to see how it would work. He was beginning to develop his own version of Francis's practice of holy poverty, a kind of a 20th century version of Francis's practice of holy poverty. And he was doing it, like Francis, as a kind of social critique and as an experiment in how we might change the order that we live in, the social order that we live in. So Peter wrote in this really strange little genre that he invented that he called the easy essay. People will talk about them as free verse poems. I actually think of them as being something like rap that you would hear now, but definitely much more didactic. So I want to give you one of his greatest hits so you can kind of hear Peter's voice. One of his most famous easy essays. It's titled Blowing the Dynamite. He says, writing about the Catholic Church, a radical writer says, Rome will have to do more than play a waiting game. She will have to use some of the dynamite inherent in her message. To blow the dynamite of a message is the only way to make the message dynamic. If the Catholic Church is not today the dominant social dynamic force, it is because Catholic scholars have failed to blow the dynamite of the church. Catholic scholars have taken the dynamite of the church, wrapped it up in nice phraseology, placed it in a hermetic container, and sat on the lid. It is about time to blow the lid off so that the Catholic Church may again become the dominant social dynamic force. Okay, that's Peter's voice. Right, he's building up this theory from reading a lot of social criticism, reading Catholic social teaching, reading a lot of theorists, and he is beginning to have this picture of how, as he said, Catholicism has a better answer to the social problems of our day than communism or capitalism does. And he's doing all of this while he's practicing voluntary poverty himself. All right, so in the face of our move, this historical shift I was tracing last night from economies of relationship to economies of strangerliness, in this time where we're shifting from face of our move from economies of relationship to economies of strangeliness, which has caused a fragmentation where we have charity and faith on one side and justice and economics on the other, Peter Morin proposed what he called a synthesis. This was a big word for him, synthesis, pulling the pieces together. And at the center of his synthesis, he put the conviction that our lives are necessarily bound up in a common good. Now, the common good is like a big word in Catholic social thought. So what on earth is the common good? Okay, this is the thought experiment I'll do with my students. Usually when we think about goods, something that you want, something that you like, if you share them with other people, you have less. Right, I've got my apple pie. If I let you guys have some of my apple pie, that's less apple pie for me. That's the usual way we think about sharing goods. Common goods, though, these are goods that I can only have the thing I want by having it with other people. Okay, there's the puzzle for you. What are the things that you want in your life that you actually can't have unless you have them with other people? Brilliant. I was going to come to that one later. Parks is a great example. I love being out in public parks. Because precisely, I don't want it to myself. I want to be there because I want to see the people out enjoying the day. That's part of the beauty of being there. Certainly friendships, families, marriage. But yes, things like a great concert. Would I love to, okay, I'm not really a Pink fan, but Pink was last night. Would I love to have a private concert with Pink? Okay. But the real pleasure of the concert is being there with the other fans, right? In the mosh pit, or singing the favorite song together, or pounding to get them to come back out to do the encore. Like, there's a joy we have in having these things together. Have you ever been in a choir? Right? There's a pleasure in generating music in a choir that we don't have on our own. I have this theory that I need to make my students learn to do contra dancing, so that they would have a referent for the common good, right? There are pleasures you can only have by having them alongside other people. And these are things that we really want, we really value. Okay, in Catholic social teaching, the common good, like a big "the" in front of that idea, the common good is this claim that the fullness of human life is like that. It's something we really only have when we all have it. When we talk about, in the tradition, heaven is a city. It's not my private island. It's a city, because the joy of our communion with God is a common good, something we have. We only fully have the delight of it when we have it together. Okay, so Peter's taking this idea of the common good, big idea in Catholic thought. Peter quotes it from Thomas Aquinas. To talk about how, to talk about the social order that he lived in, and it's the center of this kind of synthesis that he was creating. Now, Catholic social teaching, if you don't know much about Catholic social teaching, one of the good things about it is it's all available online for free. Complain about the church all you want, but all the documents are available for free online. There's a thing you can look up called the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's very easy to search. And it was an attempt to sort of synthesize a lot of different documents and create a kind of unified picture of the church's social teaching. And in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, it talks about the doctrine of the common good, and then it says the key corollary of this is a thing called the universal destination of goods. That's your $10 phrase for today, the universal destination of goods. What this means, it's a really simple idea. What it means is that God didn't create rich and poor people. God created humanity and created the earth as a home for us. And the distinctions that have grown up among us, where some people have lots and other people have none, God didn't do that. God intends the earth to meet everybody's needs. So universal destination of goods, what it means is we're talking about the goods of the earth, right? The food, land, water, air, bird watching, whatever, all that kind of stuff, is intended to meet everybody's needs. Its purpose, its destiny, if you want, is universal for everybody. So the universal destination of goods. Goods are intended to meet everybody's needs. This is a thought that you can, particularly if you're a nerd and want to look this up, St. Basil has a lot to say about this from the early centuries of the church. And it has been repeated through Catholic social thought recently. So this is, as the compendium puts it, you want to sort of bring the common good down to a basic social principle. This is it. The goods of the earth are intended to meet everybody's needs. No, that doesn't mean the Catholic Church is opposed to private property. I'm sure you're probably aware of this and maybe are relieved, having I just said that. Private property is fine. In fact, the church thinks private property is a pretty good system. But the way the Catholic Church understands private property is it's a good way to let lots of people have some responsibility and some control and some creative agency and to meet everybody's needs. So yes, you can have a system of private property as long as what it's ultimately doing is meeting everybody's needs. Private property doesn't mean I've got my stuff and nobody else has a claim on me. That's not the Catholic idea of private property. Private property means I get some stuff to work on and I can use that as my basis for contributing to being sure that everybody else is okay as well. John Paul II talked about this as a social mortgage on private property, that yes, you have private property, but there is an obligation, an underlying obligation connected to it. In Rerum Novarum, the way it comes out is a call to strongly support private property, but it says the law is supposed to promote widely distributed private property. Not private property that means some people get to hold a lot while other people have nothing, but we want a system where lots of people have enough property that they can themselves be agents in their lives. They can do work with it. So in Peter's time, there was a group of English Christian thinkers, including G.K. Chesterton, you may have heard of, is also a novelist, who developed this economic school called distributism. And distributism argued that the center of a good, stable, productive, healthy economic order is widely distributed private property, held by people who use it as part of their own local work. You can think of this as a way to democratize private property rather than centralizing control, either in the hands of the government, that's one solution, or in the hands of a small set of people who are running the economic order. This is a way to be sure that everybody has some property. So Peter saw this not only as a productive way forward, a more stable economic system than the kind of large-scale speculative investment that brought down the order in 1930. He lived through the Great Depression. A lot of his writing is writing about what he saw in the Great Depression, the enormous rise in poverty, large numbers of people in the streets without work. That's a situation he was very familiar with. And he thought this was the kind of approach that we needed to take if you wanted to create an order that was actually better for people and more stable. True, there are always going to be kind of drudge tasks that nobody wants to do, right? Digging, sweeping, grading undergraduate papers, whatever. But when lots of people, ordinary people, have a stake in their own work, when they're working on something that they own, that they have a long-range vision for, that they're contributing to the shape of, then it's easier to see that drudgery as still part of your own gift to the world, right? Part of your way of caring for other people, an occasion for your own kind of responsibility. Again, John Paul II talked about this, and his term was, there's a subjective aspect of labor. There's the objective part, you've got to make stuff. Stuff's got to get done. But then there's the part where the human person ought to be experiencing work as their gift for the world. So Peter talked about this concretely. I mean, Catholic social teaching stays at 20,000 feet, right? Peter got much more concrete. He's looking at the US and says, right, here's what we ought to be doing. We need to go back to the land, small farmers. Small farms, Peter thought the small farms were great. He was also in favor of workshops, crafts. He said the solution, we're in the middle of the Depression, so many people out of work. Get together with your friends and figure out what you've got. What kind of skills do you have? What kind of resources do you have? What can you do in your own place? And start doing it. Small scale. But work with your friends to come up with a way that you can have control over your own work. So this is a way that networks of farmers and of craftspeople can be practical about managing their own resources. They can, and at the same time, be committed to taking care of each other, helping each other through a crisis, engaging each other as full human persons. So that's what Peter was working on, figuring out how do we set up networks where there is local agency and local control of work, widespread private property, particularly by going back to the land, but to some extent even in the cities. Peter was a peasant. He wanted us all to be happy farmers and thought it was great for Catholics. You can have lots of babies on a farm. There's always work for the children. But he knew, right, we've got cities. We have to figure out how to do this in cities as well. So this is where people with their own property can live in community and help each other survive, not as an external act of charity outside of the economic order, but because the reality in that kind of economic order is we need each other. We depend on each other. We discover our kinship with each other. And that's the way Peter thought you do private property as a part of, not at odds with, the universal destination of goods. Right? So I want to turn to another proposal that Peter admired and that Catholic tradition has really supported. Another way we do economics that builds up our sense of mutuality, makes relationship again into part of the normal pattern of our economic lives, our business lives, our public lives. And I'm going to be drawing here on the work of, I didn't bring the book up with me, I've got it there, a book by Nathan Schneider. I mean, Peter Morin was this like kind of crazy voluntary beggar in the 1930s. He died in, Colin, 1950? 49? Yeah. So Peter Morin's been gone a long time. Nathan Schneider is actually a young, cool guy who's got a web page. He's a professor at the University of Colorado. He's Catholic. He writes about all kinds of stuff, but his Catholicism like leaks into these works in really interesting ways. So Nathan Schneider wrote a book called Everything for Everyone, The Radical Tradition That Is Shaping the Next Economy. It's quite readable. Again, this is something you could easily get hold of. And it's a study of the rise of cooperativism in our day. So cooperatives were another one of the things Peter saw a lot of hope in. Peter said, you know, one of his pet peeves is people say, they ought to do this, they ought to do that. One of his essays was, everybody talks about what they ought to do. Why don't you talk about what you're going to do? Right? Let's say, here's what I'm going to do. I can do this. What if I ask what you can do? And then I can talk about what we can do. And that's when we're making some progress. So stop worrying about what they're going to do. Let's talk about what we can do. That's the spirit of cooperativism. Okay, I have lived in St. Paul, and I realize that when you hear cooperative, the first thing you think may be hippie grocery store, or maybe a really great grocery store. I don't know how you feel about this. That's one version, right, where buyers pool their resources and make a consumers cooperative. But cooperatives are actually really common in the U.S. Most of the rural U.S. got its electricity and still gets its electricity through cooperatives. And those are actually very big and not very socially progressive. So it's a form of economic organization that can have a lot of different looks to it. Schneider talks about Bitcoin, for God's sake. I don't understand Bitcoin remotely, but it turns out it has something to do with people trying to gain local control of economic structures, of finance, really. He talks about the building of solidarity economies for racial justice. In Dayton, one of the most exciting and transformative things that has happened in the last 10 years is a very impoverished section of town met up with a bunch of really great organizers who managed to convince people we can take control of our own situation and build ourselves a grocery store. There were 40,000 people and no grocery store in that part of town. And after a number of years of organizing and building support for a wide variety of people and people chipping in small donations, they came up with a way to start their own darn grocery store that they own and that they make policy for. So building up our capacity by collaborating with each other. That's how cooperative systems work. So what Schneider particularly helps us to see, though, in this book is how strongly Catholic tradition has been involved in the development of cooperatives, both as a kind of an ideal type, as a theory, and as an actual way for people to work together. And this has to do with this recurring theme of the universal destination of goods. When Schneider talks about this, of course, he references the book of Acts, right? The early followers of Jesus, the Holy Spirit's poured out on them. And one of the first things that happens, they build up a community together where there are no poor among them because they share their goods when they're in need. But beyond that, religious life, monasteries. We may think now again about monasteries as kind of fringy associations, but in the medieval world, monasteries were big agricultural innovation centers, major economic players. They were the place where political treaties got worked out, really significant centers for education and for culture, and they were built around a principle of sharing of property. He also talks about the commons. In the medieval world, peasants survived in part because they had common property, oftentimes forests or fields where everybody could go and collect their firewood or do pasture a cow, right? Do a little bit of hunting. So there's a place where people owned things in common. Professional life was governed by guilds. where people involved in a common industry worked out policies for their industry together as a cooperative venture. And those often had a little liturgical life, right? A kind of a saint that they were identified with and roles in liturgical life. But that's looking in the medieval world. In the 20th century, though, there have been a number of cases of priests and parishes in different parts of the world turning out really interesting cooperative ventures. There's a guy named Beppe Tonello, gotta love that, Italian, but he was in Ecuador in the 1970s, in an area in rural Ecuador, fostered a whole network of cooperatives that brought vitality to that area when all of the regions around them were suffering great poverty. A New Hampshire parish in the early 20th century developed the very first credit union in the United States, which is a cooperative form of banking. A guy named Father Albert McKnight was organizing cooperatives in the 1960s in Mississippi as a way to build up the dignity of African American farmers. And the most famous one you may have heard of, okay, I'm going to try to say this name. Once I'm going to say the full name. Father Arizmendi Arrieta. I know, it's a mouthful. So people usually say Father Arizmendi. In the Basque region of Spain, who convened a group of his parishioners who were workers to study the documents of the church together, to think together about their situation, how they can improve their situation, and hatched out of that a thing called the Mondragon Cooperative, which became a family of cooperatives and which is now a very successful international corporation. And the place where when I meet people in the US who are interested in cooperatives and they really want to learn, they make a pilgrimage to Spain, to Mondragon, to learn how to do a cooperative. That was hatched out of a priest in a parish reading Catholic social teaching with his parishioners. So again, what's great about cooperatives is that this is a way that people who don't have a lot of control can pool their resources, discover their strengths rather than just being identified with their weaknesses, and figure out how they're going to address their needs. And Peter Morin really saw this as getting out of that they mentality and thinking, what can I do? What can you do? What could we do to make change? And Peter, along with Dorothy Day, one of the great gifts they gave us was they said, don't be afraid to be small. Don't be afraid to do the small thing. You're looking at these problems in the world and they're so huge, you don't know how to fix them, and you think, oh, does it matter that we do this? No, do the small thing. Whether it makes a bigger impact, we'll leave that in God's hands. Your step is take the risk of trying something new, something small, and see what God will do with this small seed. You may know Dorothy Day loved Therese of Lisieux and the little way. This is what she meant by the little way. Do the little thing and trust that God can use that to change the world. Now, the problem with cooperatives is that they demand a lot from their members. It is hard work. Schneider enjoys, I think, documenting cases where there are cooperatives, and when he talks to the members, they don't even know that they're part of a cooperative. They've never even considered attending a meeting. They don't actually have any involvement. The problem with cooperatives is that it's very hard work to make business decisions in a collaborative way. It's frustrating, right? It means you have to handle a lot of conflict. People have different ideas and different interests, and if you're going to work together, you're going to have to figure out how to do that. It involves sharing risk, trusting each other with our investments. It means staying together when things get really hard. Now, this also means that cooperatives are more resilient in a downturn because people are invested in trying to make it work. But there's no question that it is difficult. It's very demanding. Father Arizmendi, who I was mentioning with the Mondragon Cooperative, he said some people look at his work and said, wow, this is like a business venture that has an educational side. And he said, actually, it's more an educational venture that has a business side, because the real work is forming people to be able to work together. That's the real challenge of it. And that's the real project of it, building the relationships. The guy who's been at the center of building that cooperative in Dayton I was talking about says, it's great that we've got the grocery store, but the real thing we were trying to build was a sense of people in this area that they can work together to make change for themselves. That's the real work, right? Forming people to take control locally. So any cooperative behavior, it takes a good plan. It takes training in how to make decisions together. There's a lot of expertise about this that you can use. And it involves dealing with disagreements and conflicts, which brings us back to something else about Peter Morin's thought. Okay, so I'm shifting back from Schneider. Let's go back to think about Peter Morin. Peter had this idea, it's very compelling to me, that we need to think about faith and charity and personal sacrifice as central to our economic lives. I know that those are things that are important to us, but they tend to be important to us at home or in our devotional lives, maybe in the parish, but we don't think about them as part of our economic life. Peter was pointing out, look, it is not easy. In fact, it's going to be risky and it's going to be costly, financially and personally, to launch out with other people in making these kinds of changes. You have to learn to trust people. It's very scary, and it is risky. As I said, Peter himself had taken on this practice of voluntary poverty, and he understood that as part of how you do economic change. So, I mentioned to you that Peter started this, at one point, this work where he was giving his labor and asking for people to give him not wages, but a gift in return, that he would give his labor as a gift to them, and they should give him a gift in return, whatever they thought it was worth. That's how, for Peter, bringing about economic change, we think we can't do it. He says, you can do it. You just have to be willing to put everything in on it and live very modestly to make it happen. So, no, okay. So to come back to this question of spiritual struggle and conflict within the economic order, because I do think, the financial threat, the kind of poverty sacrifice that Peter made central to promoting this kind of economic change, that's one thing. But the fear of having to engage other peoples and argue with them about what's important is another obstacle altogether. For me, I think this is even the bigger one. I say that, I'm not sure. Maybe, it's at least as big. I hate conflict. I hate having to get into conflict with people. And that's part of the appeal of this kind of strangerly economy. You don't have to argue with people. You just have the money or you don't. So how do we deal with conflict? And I think this is underlying a lot of our ways of thinking about beggars as well. I draw here on Oscar Romero, who was Archbishop of San Salvador. This was a guy who lived with a lot of conflict. And he was kind of a pugnacious guy anyway. He was not somebody who shied away from conflict. But there's a homily he preached to people, and he said, we don't like conflict. But he said, I think we should say, there's conflict, God be blessed. He saw conflict as a good moment because he said what's happening is you finally gotten to the point where you found where it hurts. You're touching the wound. You're touching what's damaged, what's broken. And it's painful, and we resist it. And so we get heated up, right? We come into conflict. Romero said we need to come into that moment knowing this is the moment of grace. This is the moment of change. It's the possibility for healing emerging out of that, if we can learn to use it constructively. So building an economic system where mutuality, where sharing, where risk-taking, where struggling through conflict together is a normal part of the way we engage in our public lives, where we get better at doing that because we have to do it all the time. That's what I see as so powerful in Peter's stories about building up local craft economies, building up cooperatives. But it is hard. I'm going to see if I can find another easy essay I wanted to share with you. And I think this helps you hear how Peter thought about this, the kind of personal sacrifice that it would take. Two of them. Okay, let's do this one. Peter wrote, "The central act of devotional life in the Catholic Church is the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The sacrifice of the Mass is the unbloody repetition of the sacrifice of the cross. On the cross of Calvary, Christ gave his life to redeem the world. The life of Christ was a life of sacrifice. The life of a Christian must be a life of sacrifice. We cannot imitate the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary Calvary by trying to get all we can. We can only imitate the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary by trying to give all we can. Okay, well, so I'm getting near the end of this thing. And I want to spell out yet more of the big picture that I see this thing connected to. As I said, the way I think about this, when we talk about beggars, it's like this very neuralgic point. There's all kinds of anxiety and distress and confusion around it, and I think that's because it's connected to so many things. So many things. I mean, there's just the person and you on the street corner, and yet the reverberations go so far. I want to just point out to you some of the other things that this is connected to, which we're not going to resolve, but I'd like you to recognize them. Because street homelessness is not the only place where we need to be reflecting on our relationship to each other's needs and each other's hurts, what we mean by our own freedom, what we mean by justice in the world. So here's a question for you. How are we picturing the challenges coming for us in the large numbers of migrants in our day and in the coming decades? You may know people who pay attention to trends in climate change. Some of them are estimating as many as 1.2 billion people will have been displaced by 2050. So when people can no longer survive where they have been living, people who are living in low-lying coastal areas where some of the world's largest cities are, people who are living in areas that are already arid or that are prone to flooding or at risk from fire, many of the people who live in those places are already short on resources. They're going to have to move. Where are they going to go? And who's going to welcome them? How are we preparing ourselves for that challenge? And I mean preparing ourselves psychologically, spiritually, but also practically, thinking about how do we build up relationships that have the capacity to see new people arriving as gifts, as new partners, as new producers, new consumers, new people participating in building up our society rather than encountering those people as threats. I think that's connected to the way we think about beggars. Some of those same anxieties are related to that. I'll just tell you that, because this has been on my mind for quite a while, right? The question I ask myself is, who am I going to be in these coming decades? I can't fix everything. I can't stop it from happening. Who am I going to be? Thinking about Peter, not what they should do. What can I do? What can me and my friends do? So I volunteered to house a refugee family for, it was about 6 months in 2022. I have space for this and resources for it, and it was fine. And I will tell you that in that culture of life I was talking about, my refrigerator became a mess. And Colin and I were talking about, you know how the real politics of a household works when you try to figure out what the temperature on the thermostat should be, right? So there was conflict involved in this, trying to figure out how we're going to live together. And there was a lot of hilarity, that kind of joyous hilarity. I have Spanish, I speak Spanish, but my Spanish is really lousy. I use it unabashedly a lot, but it's very bad. And so there was a lot of communicating through Google Translate. I don't know if you've had a lot of experience using Google Translate, but if you want a big laugh sometime, try to have a serious conversation with somebody using Google Translate. It's hilarious. A woman was asking me to help intercede for her partner who was in jail, and Google Translate told me she was talking about a car. Anyway, my life became a Mercedes, specifically, actually. My life became much more complicated and much more joyous in that time period where they were living with me. And I'm happy now to say I'm an auntie, right? I'm an auntie to a kid who's growing up now in the US, a little kid whose first few months were passed in my household. That's a great gift to me. I think training ourselves to see the gift and the possibility and the joy, and it's going to be hard. Yeah, it's going to be hard. And it's good. That's a really important thing we can be doing as we're thinking about the way we engage beggars. Think about the larger connections to that. Another example of this, I think, is in the way we think about people who have disabilities and people who are elderly. As I said, in this kind of culture of life business, one of the particular concerns is how we think about human frailty. We have an aging population, and I'm a member of it, as a few of you might be as well. In a culture that so prioritizes independence, how do we accept for ourselves that we need help, that we need support? I mean, one of the saddest things in the world to me is an older person saying, well, I don't want to ask my kids for support because I don't want to be a burden to them. Oh my God, if we can't do that within our own families, right, of course you should ask me for help. That's not a burden, that's love, right? That's what a family is. So training ourselves to think about how we welcome people who have different kinds of needs, disability, age, children. We talked about the noisy beggars who are the children in our household. If you just another recommendation, if you don't know what l'Arche is, L'Arche, go look that up. Talk about a life of Christian hilarity. These are beautiful communities that are centered around people with significant disabilities. And then all in, that's the motto. And then I think there is an element of these concerns also that has to do with our ability or our inability to think about our society's legacy of past harms. So how do we talk about the inherited inequalities that arise from injustices to Native Americans and to the descendants of people who were enslaved? Now, I know there are a lot of practical questions about how to do that, what that looks like. But before we get to those questions about how, we have to get to the place where we can think about the fact that there are obligations to each other, that there are, needs and stories that would be hard for us to listen to, that we should be able to receive as gifts as well. Costly gifts, hard, messy, but gifts, because Catholic faith says we are made for the common good. I don't get the fullness of my life with God unless I'm able to have all of my brothers and sisters with me. So what's going on with my brothers and sisters? Becoming able to enter into that conversation and move toward change. It's very hard. I was in a conversation a couple of years back where somebody said, talking about this is like walking through a fire. But she said, the thing is, there's no life if I stay on this side of the fire. Right? If I want full life, I have to do this. I think that's where we are. And I think all of these things are related, right? These are the kind of tendrils that come out when we're encountering the person on the street on Tuesday morning who we don't know what to do with. Because this is about meeting somebody else's needs that's making uncomfortable demands on me, and I have to struggle with, wait a minute, I'm not sure how this relationship works. I wish I could, actually I don't. Even if I did wish I could fix this for you, I couldn't. I couldn't possibly fix that for you. What I can do is say to you, we can organize our lives better so that we are more prepared to be in those relationships, to be in those conversations, and to claim them as moments of possibility and beauty and hilarity. And yes, as Jesus said, the cross comes along with that. That's how Christianity works. So this is my word to you. I think we have to be bold. This is a moment for boldness. We are in a very difficult moment. Be bold. John Paul II liked to quote, put out into the deep. That's what Jesus said, put out into the deep. And we can count on the mercy of our God, because our God is all in. And that's what God invites us to be as well, all in. So I'll stop there. We can have some conversation about that. Yeah, that's good.
All right, I will call us together and then usurp my privilege and take the opportunity to ask the first question. So we were talking at our table about, it seems like part of the 20,000-foot view of what Kelly's been saying is that I can't tell you what to do about each individual encounter that we have with the poor, because there are so many variables that the answer in each case, there isn't going to be an answer in each case, and it's going to be different. But one thing that we can do is to take baby steps in our own lives to try to forge, call them whatever you want to call them, sort of very microeconomic systems of dependence upon one another to create a culture where there's less fragmentation and we need each other less, we need each other more.
Yeah.
And there's more dependence so that the encounters with beggars would be less frequent because we would have a more personal society. One of our Hunter, a seminarian at our table, said, you know, one of the things about this is that there's so much, compared to sort of economics as the status quo economics, there's so much risk sort of involved and the unknowns involved that you really kind of have to undertake such an enterprise as an act of Christian faith and as an act of discipleship. And so I guess this is one of those kinds of questions that I don't usually like, which is less of a question and more of a comment. But do you see? Am I getting right the sort of the overarching connection between the kind of economics that Peter Marin is describing and the world of beggars that we see outside?
Yeah, that's great. I would say yes to all that, but I would add a little more, which is to say this the kind of distributist idea, trying to consciously move toward a society where there is a wider distribution of property. Just to spell out the obvious, that's about undoing income inequality as well, right? And the U.S., as you may know, has extraordinarily high levels of income inequality for the kind of country that we are. Wealth inequality even more so. So that like when you see distribution maps about distribution of wealth in the U.S., like wealth meaning not your income, right, but your total, like, do you own a house, do you have a savings account, all that kind of stuff. The bottom 40% of people in the U.S. don't even show up on the graph, right? The amount of accumulated wealth they have is sort of down here, this tiny fraction, and then 60% have this bigger chunk. Now, we all talk about the 1%, fair enough, or the 10th of 1%, but I think we have to pay attention to that 60% as well, which is probably where many of us are, somewhere in the maybe the 80%, I don't know. So I am interested in actually thinking about the bigger question of why there is so much desperate poverty. What's generating that? And you know, the beauty of this kind of focus on cooperative thing, part of it is, yes, it's about retraining us to have a greater capacity to imagine the world as a place where other people and other people's needs are an opportunity to be engaged rather than a burden, where that can be part of what it means for me to live a free and full life rather than a threat, right, to my free life. That's certainly part of it. But the other part of it is actually about trying to address that problem of why there are so many people in such desperate circumstances and why in a very wealthy, very scientifically, technologically advanced society, we can't provide mental health care better for people who need it, or health care, period, for people who are sick. So I do actually think this is also about trying to address the underlying causes of so many people living in these kind of circumstances. And then if I could just add one more piece to it. The other piece to it, you may have noticed when I was talking about cooperatives, a lot of occasions, in possibly every occasion of cooperatives I know about, have grown out of need, right? People do this. It's a hard thing to do, but people do it because there's nobody providing this service for them. They have to figure out a way to provide the service for themselves. And people who study these stuff say that people who live closer to poverty tend to be more generous. The experience, knowing how to live on the edge, knowing that you live in a risky circumstance makes it easier to live with risk and makes, making room for other people's difficulties easier in your own life because you're more used to making room for people's problems, including your own. Just as a case in point, I was talking last night about a particularly horrific example of street homelessness from last winter, a guy who was I mean, just clearly schizophrenic and unmedicated and sleeping on a park bench a block away from my house for a week. And I can't get any services for him, and I've talked to him. I can't get him to agree to go to any services. And I've been trying to figure out what I could do. And I mentioned this to one of my neighbors, who is a woman, Appalachian white poverty, history of drug abuse in the family. She's got 5 people living in the house where the same size I live, just myself, right? 5 people and 4 dogs. So she's living kind of on the edge. And she said, oh yeah, I talked to that guy. She said, I told him he could come take a shower down at my place if he wanted, but he couldn't bring his bags in the house because she said there's going to be bugs and stuff in the bags. So I told him he'd have to leave the bags outside, and he wouldn't do it because he didn't trust leaving his bags outside. And I was like, she offered to let him come in and take a shower in her house. Like, I wouldn't have done that. But I think this is about building capacity actually to address those deeper needs and recognizing that taking these steps that feel so risky to us, we may be overestimating the risk. I mean, it's a risk, it's change, it's different for us. But recognizing that most people live with much higher degrees of risk than we do, and find ways to do very well, and find ways to have networks of people who help them manage well, and are able then also to become more compassionate, more capacious for welcoming other people. I think that's the other part of what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
What other questions are there?
Yeah, Father.
I think some of the challenge of this is we have our Christian response, our understanding of our connectedness or lack thereof. But then also, especially in this kind of political season, what is the government response? And sometimes that's where the debate comes in terms of personal response, personal responsibility, or community response, community responsibility versus, looking toward the other or a system. And I know that there's always somewhere in between. But in general, with Martin, Roger, what was the disposition in that balance that they would have in terms of what do we take on as responsible Christians and
What belongs to the government?
versus what do we like
Yeah. I really need to find, okay, I'm going to have to do it from memory. I was going to look up this this easy essay from Peter Moore. Thank you. It's actually, the answer is not straightforward at all. But I wanted to start with this. There's an easy essay. I'm going to try to channel Peter out of my memory, where he says, in the early centuries of Christianity, the poor were fed by Christians at a personal sacrifice, and housed by Christians at a personal sacrifice, and clothed by Christians at a personal sacrifice. And the pagans said, see how they love one another. Now the poor are fed and clothed and housed at the expense of the state. And the pagans say of the Christians, see how they pass the buck. So, there's a mic drop, right? So one of the questions Peter was asking, which is a little different than the question you're asking, but I do want to raise it, is before we start talking about what is or isn't the responsibility or the possibility of the state, the first question to ask, what are Christians called to do? And to understand that proclamation of the good news doesn't have to take the form of asking people if they've accepted Jesus as a personal Lord and Savior. It may have to do with offering the witness of living at a personal sacrifice in order to love our neighbors. And again, normalizing that as something that's part of our Christian life, that of course as a Christian you would be taking on those obligations. So that's the first thing. Before we start talking about the role of the state, let's talk about our role. And never give that up, because that's about our calling. Peter really emphasized that, and because he was so much about building up local agency. Again, remember, he's writing in the context of the Great Depression, like things have just collapsed, and he's thinking about how we can do for ourselves, the kind of power that we have in our own hands, and never giving that power up. right? Never giving up on our own creativity or on what God can do among us. So that was really big for Peter. Dorothy had a more complicated view of this. On the one hand, definitely all the stuff Peter was saying, yes, personal commitment at a personal sacrifice. You never hand that off or look for somebody else to do that for you. On the other hand, Dorothy understood in a way that I think Peter didn't contend with the complexity of some of the systems we live in and the difficulty for people of meeting those needs adequately on a local basis. This parish doesn't have the capacity to meet all of the needs of the people who are unhoused in downtown St. Paul. I would venture that the diocese doesn't have the resources that would be needed to do that. So we want to be realistic about what are the things that we can do and not deny the fact that, in fact, there are things that need to be done by other bodies as well. In this country, when we talk about the common good of the nation, the church certainly has an important role in that, and I would like us to own that in a much more significant way than we do. But laws matter, right? Policies matter. And so it does matter what kinds of things the government says and does, what kinds of views it promotes. And, another little bit of Catholic social teaching people talk a lot about is the doctrine of subsidiarity. And subsidiarity means you want to give the power to address the problem to the people closest to the problem that you can. So if it's happening in your neighborhood, the first thing you want is consult with people who are in the neighborhood, right? If it's happening in a family, first you want to work with the people in the family. Don't have the federal government intervening in somebody's family until you, figured out that that's what you need. So problems should be solved at the lowest level possible. But part of the doctrine of subsidiarity is there are different levels, and some problems can only be handled at much larger levels. If you're dealing with multinational corporations, the parish can't fix that. And it's worth thinking about what kinds of government policies might be necessary to ensure that there are better, fairer trading relations. If you're talking about climate change, I'm all in favor of local personal action, absolutely. But there are some big policy questions that need to be addressed. If you're talking about how we're going to treat migrants and refugees, there are just questions that, as much as we're going to commit to being people who love our neighbors and recognize that the common good does not have national boundaries, as much as we're going to do that, there are going to be questions of national policy that are a part of that are important. So I think that's the way I would put it. On the one hand, never give up our power and our gift, our opportunity, our responsibility to be personally engaged and to do that at a personal sacrifice, to push ourselves to do more of it. But never use that rhetoric as an excuse to say, we shouldn't have laws, right? I mean, you do actually need to have a system of government. That is supervising the things that have to fall at a much higher level. That's the world that we live in. Now, if it all collapses and we end up, living in small communities of people in the grasslands, we won't have to worry about that problem. But that's where we are now. So that's the best I can kind of say about that. Is that helpful? Yeah.
Got time for one or two more questions, maybe?
Go.
I'll try to be loud here, but I don't have the loudest voice. But so you talked a lot last night and a bit today about how tenderness, care, healing, even giving money happens mostly within the home rather than in public places. And like when it happens, with the beggar, that creates some concerns and what's going on here, is it safe, what's the money going to be used for, all that stuff. I would say that in my experience, especially in the last few years since I met Colin, I've been able to make a little bit of progress in having some interactions with, and even relationships with the poor and with beggars. But one thing that kind of continues to hold me back, I think, is just what are other people thinking when they see me do this? because I, have never been in a situation where I've been poor or on the streets, and I have lived a very comfortable life, and I always kind of have a little bit of a worry, like, what are my family members thinking if they see me going and hanging out with this poor person, or even just interacting with them? What are my friends thinking? What are the people driving by that say, you're not in the right place because you're this white guy that clearly, has some money and, shouldn't be at the homeless shelter next door just talking to people. Do you have any advice for like how to move beyond that? It's probably not an easy question to answer.
Okay, so the question for the recording, do this briefly, was saying, in addition to all the kinds of things I've talked about, one of the obstacles I haven't talked about is when I'm encountering a beggar, engaging with them, how do I deal with the way other people outside of that encounter observe me doing that, and the way they think about it, and judge it or assess it yeah, right. So let me just ask you, what is it you think they're saying about you?
Well, they're saying either like you don't belong there, or you got to be careful. Maybe you shouldn't be giving them money, or they're thinking like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to just be some savior, or just all those different thoughts kind of go through my head.
Yeah. Well, okay, I'll give you what I got, kind of off the cuff. On the one hand, the first thing I would say about that is ask yourself, what is it that you're being bothered about? Because something about what they're thinking is bothering you. Do you still wonder if you're doing the right thing? Or are these questions that you have about yourself? And I'm not sort of singling you out. I think this is a lot of people can probably identify with, that the discomfort is, I know other people are asking this question about me, and I'm not sure I can actually give a good account of why I'm doing it. And that's why I'm uneasy about their ideas, because I'm still kind of uneasy about it myself. My answer, if that's the case, my answer is, man, I'm in favor of just letting it all out there, and say to people, you know what? I don't really know. I'm not 100% sure I'm doing the right thing, actually, and I'm trying to muddle through this. I've decided to make my mistake in this direction rather than making my mistake in that direction. And it's an ongoing experiment, and let me know what you've figured out, and I'll let you know what I've figured out, and let's see where we can go from there. So rather than trying to defend my action as right, I think this is one of those cases where we were just saying at the table, I've been doing this for many, many years, and I have never come to the point where I walk away from one of these engagements and think, wow, nailed that one. Because the problems are so big, right? You're operating in a framework where there are problems much bigger than anything you can address in that moment. So I would just be frank with people, be honest with yourself, be honest with God about that. And I mean, all of us are dancing around above, thank God, an ocean of mercy. And, if we're trying to show mercy to others and confessing our faults and hoping in God's mercy, that's what I can give there. On the other hand, if the issue is this is stirring up conflict with people, then I think I want to go back to the Romero moment and say there may be kinds of conflict that we have to figure out, okay, how can I address that conflict as a moment of opportunity to talk about something that's hurting people, or a place where people have been hurt. And my answer, if you should come to the point where you're having a conversation with people about it, is to ask questions and let them tell you the stories, right? What has their experience been, and why are they disturbed about that? Why are they worried about your safety, or worried that you're making things worse, or worried that you're, a self-righteous jerk because you're, like making them look bad or something, or worried that you're judging them, right? And open that up, and let's find out what's going on in that conflict and see if we can come to some healing through it. I don't know. That's about the best I got for that. Yeah. Oh,
Dan, you get the last word.
Thanks. Sort of related, as I totally resonate with that. And then inside it, sort of the true logistical fear inside of that, of parenting and family and bringing kids into this. Can you share some stories of how Dorothy handled that with her daughter?
Dorothy's daughter wrote a whole book about
Dorothy's granddaughter wrote a book telling the daughter's story, which is a very interesting read that does give you a different kind of picture of this life. I think on the one hand, some of the stories we could tell are stories of hilarity. That, I know a number of families that have raised children within the Catholic worker, and for the children, this is the normal way that they live. And they develop an ability to communicate with people who are very different from them, have different sort of social standards, different expectations, different hygiene, who come from a different era or a different country, or psychological disabilities, or, they develop an ability because those are the people they're around, and in the same way that they're learning to navigate everything else, they learn how to navigate that. And I think that's actually a great gift. There's a guy, Patrick, Colin, I don't know, can you help me? Patrick O'Neill, thank you, who you knew right away who I was thinking about, raised all of his kids in a Catholic worker, and I was with him one time when somebody said, okay, fine, you want to do this, but you can't seriously bring up your children sharing housing with, these people from God knows where who need housing that you're taking in. And Patrick said, look, I give my children the best life I know how to give them. And I'll quote Patrick here. Patrick said, I would no more let my daughter go to the mall to buy designer jeans than I would let her shoot up with heroin. I'm raising her in the best life I know how to raise her. I want her to learn that this is a good way to live. And so that's a real thing. Now, the Catholic worker, the place where I kind of did my Catholic worker apprenticeship, there was a family who had raised their children in the worker. Both of the children are still involved in the movement. One has gone back to the land, is doing kind of organic farming thing, and one of them is more in publishing and writing to build up the church. A rule in their household was the children were never put out of their beds, right? And the mother had these, the father was this kind of visionary who had all these international connections and these big ideas and transformative, and the mother was like, the children need stability. So we have a basic rule, right? The children have their beds, their safe place, they go to their beds at a regular time, right? There are some rules in the household that make sure the children develop a sense that they are treasured and they are cared for and that they are safe. But, the children would tell me, oh yeah, I remember laying in bed and hearing this conversation going on down the hall, right? Or the kinds of things that they were aware of going on around them. So I think it's a dance that people work out. And again, I will say, children are different and families are different and needs may be different at different moments, right? So, but I take Patrick very seriously when he says, this is actually a good way to raise my children.
All will be well and all will be well.